The man they dragged aboard the USS Tempest looked like he belonged in a shelter, not on a guided missile destroyer. His clothes were torn and stained with diesel. His beard was matted with salt and neglect. His hands trembled as two young sailors hauled him across the rain-licked deck like damaged cargo. Lieutenant Commander Bradley Ashworth watched from the bridge windows 3 decks above, his jaw tight with irritation. Another delay. Another deviation from his carefully planned patrol schedule. Another vagrant pulled from some capsized fishing boat 200 miles off the Carolina coast. What Ashworth did not know, what nobody on this ship could possibly suspect, was that the homeless man now lying on their deck had commanded destroyers before Bradley Ashworth learned to walk. Petty Officer Second Class Maya Thornton was the first to reach him with a blanket. She was 24 years old, 4 years in her Navy career, and she had learned that rank meant nothing when someone was shivering and half-drowned. She knelt beside the old man and wrapped the gray wool around his shoulders. His eyes opened slowly, and for just a moment, Maya saw something in them that made her pause. It was not confusion. It was not fear. It was assessment. The old man's gaze swept the deck, noted the positions of the crew, tracked the movement of the ship beneath him, and then settled on her face with an intensity that felt like being read. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough but steady. "Are your people all right? The ones who pulled me out?" Maya blinked. She had done dozens of rescue assists in her time aboard. Not once had the rescued person asked about the crew first. "They are fine," she said. "Sir, we need to get you to sickbay. You have been in the water a long time." The old man nodded slowly. He let her help him to his feet, and Maya noticed something else that struck her as odd. Despite his condition, despite the hypothermia that should have left him barely functional, he rose with a certain economy of movement. No wasted motion, no flailing for balance on the rolling deck. He stood the way sailors stood after decades at sea, automatically compensating for the pitch and yaw without conscious thought. Before we continue with the story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you know a veteran whose service was never fully recognized. Stories like theirs deserve to be told. Chief Petty Officer Vance Drucker arrived with 2 more sailors, and his expression made Maya's stomach tighten. Drucker was Lieutenant Commander Ashworth's shadow, the kind of man who treated cruelty as efficiency and called it leadership. "This the rescue?" Drucker looked at the old man the way someone might examine trash that had blown onto their lawn. "What is your name, old-timer?" The homeless man met Drucker's eyes without flinching. "Earl," he said simply. "Earl Jennings." "Well, Earl Jennings," Drucker said, dragging out the name with mockery, "you picked the wrong ship to get rescued by. The XO does not like delays, and you have just added 6 hours to our patrol." He turned to Maya. "Take him below. Sickbay first, then find somewhere to stow him until we can dump him in the nearest port." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Chief, he just nearly drowned. Maybe we could show some basic respect." Drucker's eyes went cold. "Did I ask for your opinion, petty officer? Move him. Now." Maya helped Earl toward the hatch that led below decks. As they walked, she felt his hand briefly touch her arm. "Thank you for your kindness," he said quietly. "But do not make trouble for yourself on my account. I have dealt with men like him before." There was something in the way he said it, a weight of experience that seemed impossible for a homeless man pulled from a sinking fishing boat. Maya wanted to ask what he meant, but they had reached the hatch and Earl was already moving through it with surprising familiarity, turning left towards sick bay without being told which direction to go. She followed him down the ladder, and, as she did, she noticed something fall from his pocket. A small patch of fabric, faded and worn almost beyond recognition. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. The design was old, very old, but she could make out what looked like an eagle and a trident. Below it, barely visible, were words she could not quite read. "Sir," she called out, "you dropped this." Earl Jennings turned, and when he saw what she was holding, his weathered face changed. For just a moment, the mask of the harmless vagrant slipped, and Maya saw something else beneath it. Something hard, something dangerous, something that made her suddenly very aware that she knew nothing at all about the man she had just helped aboard. He took the patch from her hand with a gentleness that contradicted the look in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "That belonged to someone I used to be. Someone from a long time ago." Before Maya could respond, the ship's intercom crackled to life. "Petty Officer Thornton, report to the bridge. The XO wants a status report on our guest." Earl Jennings looked up toward the overhead speaker, and something like grim amusement crossed his face. "The XO," he repeated quietly. "Well, I suppose I should meet the man who finds my existence so inconvenient." He continued toward sick bay without another word, leaving Maya standing in the passageway with questions multiplying in her mind. Who was Earl Jennings really? What did that patch mean? And why did a homeless man walk through a Navy destroyer like he had done it 1,000 times before? She did not have answers yet, but as she climbed the ladder toward the bridge and Lieutenant Commander Ashworth's inevitable displeasure, Maya Thornton had the strange and certain feeling that this rescue was going to be unlike any other. 3 decks above, Bradley Ashworth stood at the bridge windows and made a decision. The vagrant would be confined to sick bay, kept out of sight, and transferred to the Coast Guard at the earliest opportunity. He had no time for charity cases. He had no patience for delays. And he certainly had no interest in some washed-up old man whose only accomplishment was failing to drown. It was a decision he would regret for the rest of his career. Lieutenant Commander Bradley Ashworth did not look up when Maya Thornton entered the bridge. He stood at the central console with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the navigation display as if the old man 3 decks below did not exist. "Status," he said. Maya straightened. "Sir, the rescued civilian is in sick bay. Corpsman says he is hypothermic but stable. No apparent injuries beyond exposure. Name? Earl Jennings, sir. No identification on him. His boat went down approximately 6 miles from our position. He was in the water for at least 2 hours before we reached him." Ashworth finally turned, and Maya felt the familiar chill of his attention. At 34 years old, the executive officer of the USS Tempest carried himself like a man who had never been told no. His uniform was immaculate. His shoes gleamed. His Annapolis ring caught the bridge lights as he moved. "A homeless fisherman," he said flatly. "That is what we diverted for. That is what cost us 6 hours of patrol time. Sir, standing orders require us to respond to distress signals. We had no way of knowing who was in the water until we arrived." Ashworth's eyes narrowed slightly. "I did not ask for a recitation of regulations, petty officer. I asked for a status report." He stepped closer, close enough that Maya could smell his cologne. "Where are we putting him?" "Chief Drucker suggested we confine him to sick bay until transfer, sir." "Sick bay is for crew." Ashworth shook his head. "Find somewhere else. Storage compartment. Empty berthing. I do not care where, as long as he stays out of sight and does not interfere with operations." He turned back to the navigation display. "The Coast Guard can collect him when we reach Norfolk in 3 days." 3 days, Maya repeated carefully. "Sir, that is a long time to keep someone confined to a storage compartment." Ashworth did not turn around. Then he should have been more careful with his boat. Dismissed. Maya left the bridge with her jaw clenched, so tight her teeth ached. She had served under difficult officers before, but Ashworth was something different. He did not just lack compassion. He seemed to view it as weakness, a flaw to be corrected in those foolish enough to display it. She found Earl Jennings sitting on the edge of a medical cot in sick bay, a cup of coffee warming his hands. Someone had given him dry clothes, navy sweats that hung loose on his thin frame. Without the layers of salt-stained rags, Maya could see more of the man beneath. He was lean, but not frail, his forearms still corded with muscle despite his age. A scar ran along his left temple, disappearing into his gray hair. His posture, even seated, held a quality she could not quite name. Corpsman Reyes stood nearby, making notes on a tablet. She caught Maya's eye and shook her head slightly. "You should be in worse shape," Reyes said quietly. 2 hours in that water temperature. A man his age, he should barely be conscious. But his vitals are strong, stronger than some of the 20-year-olds on this ship. Earl Jennings looked up at their whispered conversation and offered a small smile. "Clean living," he said, "and stubbornness." Maya approached him, still carrying the weight of Ashworth's orders. "Mr. Jennings, I need to relocate you. The XO wants you moved to temporary quarters." Earl's eyes flickered with understanding. "Somewhere out of sight," he said. It was not a question. Maya hesitated. "I'm sorry. I tried to argue for better accommodations, but Lieutenant Commander Ashworth was clear. You do not need to apologize for following orders, petty officer." Earl rose slowly, steadying himself against the cot for just a moment. "I have given a few orders in my time that people did not agree with. The measure of a sailor is not whether they like the command. It is whether they execute it with integrity." The words hit Maya strangely. There was something almost instructional in the way he said them, as if he were teaching rather than simply speaking. She led him through narrow passageways toward an auxiliary storage compartment that had been cleared to serve as temporary berthing. The space was barely larger than a closet, with a thin mattress laid over supply crates and a single light fixture overhead. It smelled of paint and diesel. Earl Jennings surveyed his accommodations without complaint. He ran his hand along the bulkhead, fingers tracing the rivets and welds with something almost like affection. "Arleigh Burr class," he said quietly. "Phoenix ships. They got the balance right between firepower and survivability." Maya stared at him. "How do you know what class this ship is?" Earl's expression flickered, and for a moment she thought he might answer. Then the mask of the harmless vagrant settled back into place, and he simply shrugged. "Lucky guess. I have always liked ships." Before Maya could press further, footsteps echoed in the passageway behind them. Chief Drucker appeared in the hatchway, his bulk blocking most of the light. Well, he said, surveying the tiny compartment. "The presidential suite." He stepped inside, forcing Maya to press against the bulkhead. "Comfortable, old-timer?" Earl met his gaze steadily. "I have slept in worse places." "I bet you have." Drucker's lip curled. "Shelters. Doorways. Under bridges, probably." He leaned closer. "Let me be clear about something, vagrant. Your cargo. You are a delay we did not ask for. You will stay in this compartment. You will not wander the ship, and you will not speak to any member of this crew unless spoken to. If I find you anywhere you are not supposed to be, I will personally ensure the rest of your voyage is spent in the brig." He straightened. "Are we clear?" Earl Jennings was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but carried an edge that made Drucker's eyes narrow. "Crystal clear, Chief. I know exactly where I stand." Something in his tone made Drucker hesitate. For just a second, the petty cruelty in his expression wavered, replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. Then he shook it off and turned to Maya. "You have duties, Thornton. Stop babysitting the cargo and get back to work." He disappeared down the passageway, and Maya let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Earl lowered himself onto the thin mattress and looked up at her with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, only a kind of patient sadness. "Thank you for your kindness, Petty Officer Thornton. It has been a long time since anyone showed me any. Now go. Your chief is right about one thing. You do have duties, and I will not be the reason you face trouble." Maya hesitated at the hatch. "Mr. Jennings, what did you mean earlier when you said you have given orders people did not agree with?" Earl Jennings smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "I meant that I understand duty," he said quietly, "better than most people on this ship could possibly imagine." Maya left him there in the converted storage compartment, surrounded by supply, crates, and shadows. As she made her way back toward the operations center, she could not shake the feeling that she was missing something important, something that would change everything once it finally came to light. 3 decks above, Lieutenant Commander Ashworth was already planning his next move. The vagrant had looked at him with something uncomfortably close to recognition when Maya had mentioned his title. And Bradley Ashworth did not like being looked at by men who should have been looking down. Earl Jennings did not sleep that first night aboard the USS Tempest. He lay on the thin mattress in his converted storage compartment and listened to the ship around him. The hum of the engines 3 decks below. The subtle vibration of the screws turning in the water. The distant footsteps of sailors on watch. Their rhythms as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. 43 years. That was how long it had been since he first set foot on a Navy vessel. He had been 18 years old terrified and trying not to show it, shipping out to a war that would change him in ways he could not have imagined. Now he was 71, and the sea still felt more like home than any place on land ever had. He reached into the pocket of his borrowed sweatpants and touched the worn patch he had carried for 5 decades. The fabric was soft from years of handling. The colors faded almost beyond recognition. But he knew every thread, every stitch. He remembered the day it was given to him, remembered the faces of the men who had worn the same insignia, most of them now names on a wall in Washington. Dawn came slowly, gray light seeping through the gaps around the hatch. Earl rose and stretched, working the stiffness from joints that had earned every ache. He had just finished folding his blanket when footsteps approached outside. The hatch opened to reveal a young sailor, barely out of his teens, carrying a tray with breakfast. The kid's name tape read Okonkwo, and his eyes were wide with poorly concealed curiosity. "Morning, sir," Okonkwo said. "Brought you some food. Petty Officer Thornton asked me to check on you." Earl accepted the tray with a nod of thanks. "That was kind of her, and kind of you to bring it." Okonkwo lingered in the hatchway, clearly wanting to ask questions but unsure if he should. Earl recognized the look. He had seen it on young sailors for decades. "Something on your mind, son?" The young man shifted his weight. "The guys are talking, saying you were some kind of fisherman who lost his boat. That true?" Earl considered the question. "Part of it is," he said carefully. "I did have a boat, and I did lose it. Must be tough, living out on the water like that alone." Earl felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that never fully went away. "You get used to alone," he said quietly. "After a while, you almost forget there was ever anything else." Okonkwo seemed about to respond when a sharp voice cut through the passageway behind him. "Seaman Okonkwo, what exactly are you doing?" The young sailor snapped to attention so fast he nearly dropped the tray, still in Earl's hands. "Chief Drucker, I was just delivering breakfast to the civilian as ordered." Drucker's eyes moved from Okonkwo to Earl and back again. "Delivering, not socializing. Get back to your duties." Okonkwo fled down the passageway, and Drucker turned his attention fully to Earl. "You're popular this morning, vagrant." First Thornton, now Okonkwo. He stepped into the compartment, deliberately invading Earl's space. "I wonder what kind of stories you were telling them." "No stories, Chief. Just thanking people for their kindness." Drucker's expression hardened. "I am watching you, old man. Something about you does not add up, and I intend to figure out what it is." He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps fading down the passageway with military precision. Earl ate his breakfast in silence, then made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. He needed to move, to walk, to see the ship that had become his temporary prison. Drucker's warning echoed in his mind, but Earl Jennings had spent his entire life walking toward danger rather than away from it. A habit like that did not break easily. He slipped out of the storage compartment and moved through the passageways with practiced ease. His body remembered the layout of an Arleigh Burke destroyer, even if this particular ship was new to him. The design was standardized, logical, built for efficiency. Within minutes, he found himself on the mess deck, where a handful of sailors were finishing a late breakfast. They glanced at him with curiosity, but no hostility. He was just the rescued civilian, the harmless old man waiting for transfer. He collected a cup of coffee and found a corner where he could observe without drawing attention. That was when he saw it. 2 decks above, visible through an open hatch, a young sailor was working on an electrical panel. The kid had the access cover removed and was reaching inside with a tool that made Earl's blood run cold. He was on his feet before conscious thought caught up with action. He crossed the mess deck in seconds, ignoring the startled looks of the sailors he passed. He hit the ladder and climbed with speed that should have been impossible for a man his age. The young sailor, a seaman whose name tape read Fitzgerald, looked up in surprise as Earl appeared beside him. "Stop," Earl said firmly. "Do not move your hand." Fitzgerald froze, confusion and fear mingling on his young face. "What? Who are you?" Earl pointed at the panel. "You see that junction box you were about to touch? The gray one with the yellow stripe?" Fitzgerald nodded slowly. That is a DC bus tie. The breaker feeding it is not isolated. You touch that junction with a metal tool. You complete a circuit that will put 400 volts through your body. Earl kept his voice calm but firm. Your heart will stop before you hit the deck. The color drained from Fitzgerald's face. He slowly, carefully withdrew his hand. How do you know that? His voice was barely a whisper. Earl did not answer. He reached past the young sailor and pointed to a breaker 3 panels to the left. That is your isolation point. You secure that first, then you can work safely. He stepped back. Who signed off on this work order without verifying lockout procedures? Fitzgerald was staring at him now with something beyond confusion. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was standing next to someone who should not exist. I do not know, Fitzgerald stammered. Chief said it was routine maintenance. Said I did not need supervision. Earl's jaw tightened. Routine maintenance that nearly killed you. The commotion had drawn attention. Several sailors had gathered at the base of the ladder, watching the exchange with growing interest. And pushing through them, his face already twisted with anger, came Lieutenant Commander Ashworth. What is going on here? Ashworth's voice carried the crack of command. Why is the civilian out of his quarters? Earl turned to face him, and something in his bearing made Ashworth hesitate for just a fraction of a second. Your sailor was about to electrocute himself, Earl said evenly. Improper lockout procedures on a live electrical panel. I stopped him. Ashworth's eyes darted to Fitzgerald, who nodded frantically. He is right, sir. I did not know the breaker was still live. He stopped me from touching it. A murmur ran through the gathered sailors. Ashworth's face cycled through several emotions before settling on cold dismissal. Seaman Fitzgerald will be disciplined for improper procedures. He fixed Earl with a stare that could have frozen seawater. And you will return to your quarters immediately. I do not care what you think you saw. You are a civilian. You have no business interfering with ship operations. Earl held his gaze for a long moment. Then he simply nodded. Of course, Lieutenant Commander. My apologies for the interference. He walked past Ashworth and descended the ladder, feeling the eyes of every sailor on him as he went. Behind him, he heard Ashworth barking orders, reasserting control, try to reclaim authority that had somehow slipped. But the damage was done. The crew of the USS Tempest had seen something that could not be unseen. A homeless vagrant had just demonstrated knowledge of ship systems that took years of training to acquire. Knowledge that a fisherman should not possess. Knowledge that did not match the story they had been told. And somewhere in the crowd, Maya Thornton watched Earl disappear down the passageway with a single thought burning in her mind. Who are you really, Earl Jennings? Word traveled fast on a destroyer. By evening, every sailor on the USS Tempest had heard some version of the story. The homeless man had saved Fitzgerald's life. The vagrant knew things about electrical systems that took engineers years to learn. The rescued fisherman moved through the ship like he had been born on one. Maya Thornton heard at least 6 different accounts before her watch ended, each one more embellished than the last. But underneath the exaggeration, the core truth remained. Earl Jennings was not what he appeared to be. She found him in his storage compartment, sitting on a mattress with his back against the bulkhead. The worn patch was in his hands again, and he was staring at it with an expression that made Maya hesitate at the hatch. I can come back, she said quietly. Earl looked up, and the distant grief in his eyes faded behind something more guarded. No, please. It gets lonely in here, and you're one of the few people on this ship who treats me like a human being. Maya stepped inside and closed the hatch behind her. She remained standing, studying the old man who had become the most talked-about person aboard. Fitzgerald came to see me, she said. He wanted to thank you. He said you knew exactly what was wrong with that panel before you even looked at it. Earl shrugged. I saw the configuration, recognized the danger. Anyone with electrical training would have done the same. That is the thing, Mr. Jennings. Maya crossed her arms. Anyone with electrical training. A fisherman does not have electrical training. Not the kind you showed today. Earl was quiet for a long moment. The ship groaned around them, steel flexing against the sea. I was not always a fisherman, he said finally. Maya waited, but he offered nothing more. She changed tactics. What is that patch you keep looking at? Earl's fingers tightened around the faded fabric. Something from another life. A reminder of people I served with. Served with. Maya felt her pulse quicken. You were military. It was not a question, and Earl did not treat it as one. He simply looked at her with those assessing eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense. A long time ago, he said, before you were born. Before most of the people on this ship were born. What branch? Earl almost smiled. You are persistent, Petty Officer Thornton. I can see why you're good at your job. Before Maya could respond, the hatch swung open behind her. Chief Drucker filled the doorway, and a look on his face promised nothing good. Well, he said slowly, is this not cozy? He stepped inside, forcing Maya to move aside. I come to check on our guest, and I find one of my petty officers having a private conversation with him. He turned to Maya. Does the XO know you are here? I was checking on his welfare, Chief, as I was assigned to do when he first came aboard. Drucker's eyes narrowed. That assignment ended when he was moved to these quarters. He looked back at Earl. Unless you have been requesting her company specifically. Earl rose slowly from the mattress. His posture shifted subtly, shoulders squaring, chin lifting. It was a small change, but it transformed him from a tired old man into something harder to define. Petty Officer Thornton has shown me nothing but professional courtesy, he said. If you have a problem with her conduct, that is between you and her. But I will not have her reputation questioned because she treated a stranger with basic human decency. Drucker stepped closer, using his bulk to intimidate. You do not get to lecture me about conduct, vagrant. You are nothing on this ship. Less than nothing. Earl held his ground. I have been called worse by better men. Something dangerous flickered in Drucker's eyes. He reached out and grabbed the front of Earl's sweatshirt, bunching the fabric in his fist. Chief, Maya said sharply. That is assault on a civilian. Drucker ignored her. His other hand went to Earl's pocket and came out holding the worn patch. He released Earl and stepped back, examining his prize. What is this? Some kind of souvenir? He turned the patch over, squinting at the faded design. Looks military. You steal this from someone? Earl's face had gone very still. The air in the small compartment seemed to thicken. Give that back, he said quietly. Or what? Drucker laughed. You going to report me? Tell the XO that the homeless man is upset about his little piece of cloth? He held the patch up to the light. This looks old. Really old. What is this, Vietnam era? Earl said nothing. His hands had curled into fists at his sides, and Maya saw a tremor run through him that had nothing to do with age or weakness. Drucker pocketed the patch. I'm going to hold on to this. Maybe do some research. Find out if you stole it from a real veteran or bought it at some pawn shop. He smiled coldly. Either way, I'm going to find out who you really are, old man. And when I do, I'm going to make sure everyone on this ship knows what kind of fraud we pulled out of the water. He turned and left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the passageway. Maya stood frozen, watching Earl. The old man had not moved, but something fundamental had changed in his bearing. The mask of the harmless vagrant was gone, replaced by something she did not have a name for. His eyes were fixed on the hatch where Drucker had disappeared, and in them she saw decades of controlled fury held in perfect check. Mr. Jennings, she said carefully. Are you all right? Earl's voice came from somewhere far away. That patch was given to me in 1969 by a man who did not come home. His hands slowly unclenched. It is the only thing I have left of him. Maya felt her throat tighten. I am sorry. I will talk to the chief. Make him give it back. Earl finally looked at her, and the anger in his eyes softened into something sadder. It does not matter, he said. He will not find what he is looking for. The records he can access will not tell him anything useful. He lowered himself back onto the mattress, suddenly looking every one of his 71 years. Some secrets are buried deeper than a chief petty officer can dig. Maya wanted to ask what that meant. She wanted to demand answers to the questions that had been multiplying since the moment she first saw him on the deck. But something in Earl's face stopped her. This was a man carrying weight she could not imagine, and pushing him now would only add to the burden. I will find a way to get your patch back, she said instead. I promise. Earl nodded slowly. You are a good sailor, Petty Officer Thornton. This Navy needs more people like you. She left him alone in the converted storage compartment, surrounded by shadows and memories. As she walked toward her berthing, she passed a porthole and caught a glimpse of the darkening sky outside. Somewhere out there, the sea stretched endlessly in all directions. And somewhere in Chief Drucker's pocket, a 50-year-old patch held secrets that were about to change everything aboard the USS Tempest. Maya just did not know it yet. The summons came at 0800 the next morning. Earl Jennings was escorted to the bridge by two sailors who looked uncomfortable with their assignment. They did not speak to him, did not meet his eyes, but their body language told him everything he needed to know. Word of yesterday's incident had spread, and the crew was no longer certain what to make of the man they had pulled from the sea. Lieutenant Commander Ashworth was waiting on the bridge, standing at the center console with his hands clasped behind his back. Captain Richard Park stood nearby, a man in his early 50s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen more than they revealed. Drucker lurked at the edge of the space, wearing a smile that made Earl's stomach tighten. The bridge crew tried to focus on their stations, but Earl could feel their attention like static electricity. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Ashworth did not bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Jennings, do you know why you are here?" Earl kept his voice neutral. "I assume Chief Drucker has made some kind of report about me." "Chief Drucker has raised concerns, yes." Ashworth began to pace slowly, each step deliberate. "Concerns about your behavior, your knowledge of ship systems, your refusal to answer questions about your background." He stopped and faced Earl directly. "Who are you really?" "I told you when I came aboard. My name is Earl Jennings. I was a fisherman. My boat sank." Ashworth's jaw tightened. Fishermen do not know the electrical architecture of guided missile destroyers. Fishermen do not move through Navy vessels like they have spent their lives on them. Fishermen do not carry military patches from wars that ended before most of my crew was born. Earl said nothing. He could feel Captain Park watching him with an intensity that felt different from Ashworth's hostility. There was something searching in the captain's gaze, something that almost looked like recognition. Ashworth continued, "I think you're a fraud. I think you stole that patch from a real veteran, and I think you have been using some kind of stolen knowledge to impress my crew." He stepped closer. "I think you're a con artist who got lucky when his boat sank near a Navy ship, and now you are playing games with people who have actually earned the right to wear a uniform." Earl felt the old anger stirring in his chest, the fury he had spent decades learning to control. He thought of the men whose names were etched on that patch, the brothers who had bled and died in jungles half a world away. He thought of his son, who had followed him into service and never came home from Iraq. He thought of his wife, who had waited for him through 3 deployments and then waited forever when cancer took her before he could say goodbye. And he said nothing, because some wounds were too deep for words, and some men were too small to understand them. Ashworth mistook his silence for defeat. "That is what I thought." He turned to Drucker. "Chief, escort this man back to his quarters. When we reach Norfolk, he will be turned over to civilian authorities for investigation of stolen valor." The words hit Earl like a physical blow. Stolen valor. The accusation reserved for men who lied about service they never gave, who wore medals they never earned, who dishonored the memory of those who had actually sacrificed. It was the worst thing you could call a veteran, and Ashworth had just said it in front of the entire bridge crew. Something shifted in Earl's bearing. The slump of the defeated vagrant disappeared, replaced by a posture that belonged on this bridge. His chin came up, his shoulders squared, his eyes hardened into something that made Drucker take an involuntary step backward. "I've been called many things in my life," Earl said quietly. His voice carried across the bridge with a clarity that silenced every other sound. "Sailor, warrior, leader, father, husband." He paused, letting each word land. "Phantom." Captain Park made a small sound, almost inaudible. His face had gone pale. Earl continued, his gaze fixed on Ashworth. "I have been shot at in 4 different countries. I have buried friends whose names you have never heard and never will. I have given more to this Navy than you could comprehend if you served for 100 years. He stepped forward, and Ashworth actually retreated. But I will not stand here and be accused of stolen valor by a man who has never heard a shot fired in anger. The bridge had gone completely silent. Every officer, every sailor stood frozen at their stations. Captain Park spoke for the first time. His voice was hoarse. "Jennings, your name is Earl Jennings?" Earl turned to face him. "Yes, Captain." Park's hands were trembling slightly. "Earl Jennings. They called you Phantom. Mekong Delta, 68 to 72. The words hung in air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Ashworth looked between them, confusion breaking through his arrogance. "Captain, what are you talking about?" Park did not answer him. He took a step toward Earl, studying his face with growing certainty. "My father served in Vietnam, Navy advisor to the South Vietnamese. He used to tell stories about a SEAL operator who pulled his unit out of an ambush near Kino. Said the man moved like a ghost. Said he saved 19 lives that night and disappeared before anyone could thank him." Earl's expression flickered. "Lieutenant Park. I remember him. Good officer. Brava man." Captain Park's voice cracked. "He was my father. He died in 2015. He talked about you until his last day. He said meeting you was the most terrifying and inspiring moment of his life." The revelation crashed through the bridge like a wave breaking over the bow. Drucker's smile had vanished completely. Ashworth looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. And then, cutting through the stunned silence, came the one sound that changed everything. The general alarm. "All hands, this is not a drill. Fire in the engine room. All damage control teams report immediately." The announcement repeated, urgent and undeniable. The bridge exploded into controlled chaos. Officers shouted orders. Sailors rushed to stations. The ship that had seemed so stable moments ago suddenly felt fragile against the vast indifference of the sea. Earl Jennings stood motionless amid the chaos, his eyes fixed on the damage control displays that were lighting up red across the board. He knew what those patterns meant. He had seen them before, decades ago, on a ship that had not survived. And he knew that if someone did not act fast, the USS Tempest was about to become a grave. The damage control displays painted a picture that Earl Jennings had hoped never to see again. 3 separate fire indicators in the engine room. Electrical failures cascading through the port side power grid. Temperature readings spiking in compartments that should have been cool. This was not a simple fire. This was a chain reaction. Captain Park was issuing orders with calm efficiency, but Earl could see the tension in his shoulders. The crew was responding well, years of training kicking in, but they were fighting symptoms while the disease spread unchecked. Earl moved toward the damage control station, his eyes scanning the displays with an expertise that decades of absence had not dulled. A young lieutenant was coordinating the response, her voice steady, but her hands shaking slightly as she directed teams to the affected areas. "You are sending them to the wrong compartment," Earl said. The lieutenant turned, startled. "Excuse me? Who authorized you to be at this station?" Earl pointed at the display. "Look at the thermal progression. The fire started in the auxiliary machinery room, not the main engine space. Your teams are fighting the spread while the source keeps feeding it." The lieutenant hesitated, looking to Captain Park for guidance. Park met Earl's eyes. "You are certain?" Earl nodded. "The pattern is identical to a casualty I saw on the USS Steadfast in 1987. Fuel line rupture in the auxiliary space created a hidden fire that spread through the cable runs before anyone detected the source. We lost 6 sailors before we found it." His voice hardened. "You will lose more than that if you do not redirect now." Ashworth pushed forward, his face flushed with anger. "Captain, you cannot seriously be taking tactical advice from a civilian. A homeless civilian at that." Park ignored him. He studied the displays for a long moment, then turned to the damage control officer. "Lieutenant Shun, redirect Team 2 to the auxiliary machinery room. Have them approach through the starboard passage to avoid the compromised cable runs." "Captain," Ashworth protested. "That is an order." XO. Park's voice left no room for argument. The next few minutes felt like hours. Earl stood at the edge of the damage control station, watching the displays and feeling the ship shudder beneath his feet. The crew of the Tempest was good. They moved with precision and courage, trusting their training and their officers. But training could only prepare you for so much. Some situations required something more. The report came through 12 minutes later. Team 2 had found the source. A ruptured fuel line in the auxiliary machinery room, exactly where Earl had said it would be. The fire was contained. The cascading failures were being isolated. The bridge seemed to exhale collectively. Sailors exchanged looks of relief. Lieutenant Shun began coordinating the recovery efforts with renewed confidence. But Earl was not relieved. He was still staring at the displays, his brow furrowed. "Something is wrong," he said quietly. Captain Park turned. "What do you mean?" "The fire is contained." Earl shook his head. "The thermal readings in compartment 3 Delta are still climbing. That compartment should be cooling now that the source is contained." He traced his finger along the display. "Unless there is a secondary ignition point that your sensors are not detecting." Park studied the readings. The temperature in 3 Delta was indeed still rising, slowly but steadily. It could be residual heat, thermal lag in the bulkheads, or it could be a pocket fire in the insulation, Earl said, hidden from your sensors by the metal framing. "Burning slow now, but if it reaches the cable junction in that compartment, you will lose power to your fire suppression systems." Shun looked up sharply. "Sir, if we lose suppression in the current conditions, the contained fire could reflash." Park did not hesitate. "Get a team to 3 Delta. Manual inspection." Now, the waiting was worse this time. Earl found himself gripping the edge of the console, his knuckles white. Around him, the bridge crew went about their duties with professional focus, but he could feel the tension underlying every movement. They all knew that the next few minutes would determine whether this was a close call or a catastrophe. Maya Thornton appeared at his elbow. She must have come up from her station below. Her face was pale but determined. "You should not be up here," Earl said quietly. "Neither should you, apparently." She managed a small smile. "But you keep being right about things you should not know anything about." The report came through before Earl could respond. "Bridge, this is Damage Control Team 4. We found it. Pocket fire in the insulation, just like the civilians said. It was 6 inches from the cable junction. We are extinguishing now." The relief that flooded the bridge was palpable. Someone actually cheered before catching themselves. Captain Park closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were fixed on Earl. "Mr. Jennings," he said slowly, "that is twice in 5 minutes that you have identified something my trained officers missed." He stepped closer. "I think it is time you told me exactly who you are." Earl felt the weight of 50 years pressing down on him. The secrets he had carried. The man he had tried to leave behind. The life he had walked away from when there was nothing left to live for. He reached into his pocket automatically, forgetting for a moment that the patch was gone. Drucker still had it. But Drucker was no longer wearing his usual expression of smug superiority. The chief stood at the edge of the bridge, his face ashen, his hand moving unconsciously to the pocket where he had stowed the stolen patch. "Captain," Drucker said, his voice strange, "I think I need to show you something." He pulled out the worn patch and held it up. In the harsh bridge lighting, the faded design was finally visible to everyone. An eagle clutching a trident and flintlock pistol, the anchor of naval tradition. And beneath it, words that made Captain Park take a sharp breath. "SEAL Team 1, Vietnam." Earl Jennings looked at the patch that had been taken from him, at the symbol of everything he had been and everything he had lost. "I was not always a fisherman," he said quietly, "and I was not always alone." The bridge had gone completely silent again. Every eye was fixed on the old man who had saved their ship twice in the span of an hour. And in that silence, Earl Jennings finally began to speak. Earl Jennings had not spoken about Vietnam in over a decade. The memories lived in a locked room in his mind, a place he visited only in nightmares. But standing on the bridge of the USS Tempest, surrounded by sailors who had just watched him save their ship, he found the lock turning on its own. "I enlisted in 1967, he began. His voice was steady, but his eyes were focused on something far beyond the steel walls around him. 17 years old. Lied about my age to get in early. My father had been Navy, and his father before him. It was the only life I ever wanted." Captain Park had ordered the bridge cleared of all non-essential personnel. Only he, Ashworth, Drucker, Lieutenant Shun, and Maya remained. The ship was stable now, damage control teams handling the aftermath, but no one moved to leave. I qualified for the SEALs in '68, Earl continued. Back then, we did not have the training pipelines they have now. They threw us into the jungle and expected us to figure it out. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Most of us did not. He paused, gathering himself. They call me Phantom because of how I moved. I could get in and out of places without anyone knowing I had been there. It was useful in the Mekong Delta, where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. We ran operations that never appeared in any official record. We did things that the government still will not acknowledge happened. Ashworth shifted uncomfortably. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. The patch, Earl said, nodding toward the faded fabric still in Drucker's hand. That belonged to a man named Thomas Riley. Tommy. He was my best friend. We went through training together, deployed together, bled together. He stopped, and for a moment the bridge was silent except for the hum of electronics. He died in my arms on April 14th, 1969. Ambush near Ca Mau. He took 3 rounds that were meant for me. Maya felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back, but she could not look away from Earl's face. Tommy did not have any family, Earl said. No one to send his things home to. So I kept the patch. I have carried it for 53 years. It reminds me of why I survived when better men did not. Captain Park spoke softly. My father said you saved 19 men, Nirkin though. Earl nodded slowly. December 1970. Your father's advisory unit got caught in an ambush while escorting a supply convoy. I was running a solo reconnaissance nearby when I heard the gunfire. He shrugged, as if describing something mundane. I did what anyone would have done. With respect, sir, Chin said quietly, not anyone could have done what you did. I have read about that engagement in classified after-action reports. 1 operator against an entrenched enemy force. You killed 14 combatants and held the perimeter for 2 hours until reinforcements arrived. Earl's expression flickered. You have read the reports. I studied special operations history at Annapolis, sir. The Kano engagement is legendary, but the operator's name was always redacted. She paused. You're a ghost in more ways than one. Earl turned away from their stares, looking out the bridge windows at the gray sea beyond. I served until 72, he said. Then I came home and tried to forget. I got married, had a son, spent 20 years training the next generation of SEALs, then another 10 commanding ships. He drew a breath. I made Master Chief, retired with more ribbons than I knew what to do with. I thought I had earned some peace. What happened? Maya asked. The question slipped out before she could stop it. Earl was silent for a long moment. My wife died in 2003. Cancer. She was the only person who ever saw all of me, the good and the bad, and loved me anyway. When she was gone, I did not know who I was anymore. He turned back to face them. Then in 2006, my son was killed in Iraq. IED outside Fallujah. He was a lieutenant commander. Following in the old man's footsteps, he used to say. The weight of his words pressed down on everyone in the room. Ashworth had gone pale. Even Drucker looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. After that, Earl said quietly, I did not see the point anymore. I had given everything I had to this country. My youth, my friends, my family, and the country just kept taking. So I stopped. I sold everything I owned, bought a small boat, and disappeared. 10 years on the water alone. It was the only way I knew to survive. Captain Park stepped forward. Master Chief Jennings, he said, using Earl's rank for the first time. On behalf of this crew, I want to apologize for how you have been treated aboard my ship. Earl shook his head. You do not need to apologize, Captain. You did not know. I did not want you to know. He looked at Ashworth, who flinched under his gaze. I have learned that rank and medals do not make a man. Character does. Some people have it. Some people never will. Ashworth opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since Earl had come aboard, the executive officer had nothing to say. Drucker stepped forward, his hand extended with the patch. Master Chief, I should not have taken this. I am sorry. Earl looked at the patch for a long moment. Then he reached out and took it, his fingers closing around the worn fabric with reverent care. Tommy would have found all of this very funny, he said softly. He always said I took myself too seriously, said I needed to learn to let people in. He looked up at the faces surrounding him. I suppose he was right. Maya stepped forward. Master Chief Jennings, what happens now? Earl tucked the patch carefully into his pocket. Now we make sure this ship gets home safely. He turned to Captain Park. With your permission, Captain, I would like to assist with the damage assessment. I know these systems. I might be useful. Park nodded slowly. Permission granted, Master Chief. And for the record, I am glad we pulled you out of the water. Earl Jennings smiled, and for the first time since he had come aboard the USS Tempest, it reached his eyes. So, am I Captain? So, am I. The next 12 hours, it transformed Earl Jennings from cargo to crew. He moved through the damaged sections of a USS Tempest with a purpose he had not felt in years. His expertise guiding repair teams through problems that would have taken them twice as long to solve alone. Sailors who had looked at him with pity or contempt now sought his advice with genuine respect. Maya watched him work with a kind of wonder. The homeless man who had trembled on their deck 2 days ago was gone. In his place stood a Master Chief Petty Officer, retired but not diminished, his knowledge flowing as naturally as breathing. She found him in the auxiliary machinery room, inspecting the repairs to the fuel line that had nearly killed them all. His hands moved over the welded seams with practiced familiarity. You should be resting, she said. You've been going for hours. Earl straightened, wiping grease from his fingers. Sleep is for people with quiet minds, Petty Officer. Mine has not been quiet in a very long time. He looked around the compartment. But this helps. Being useful again. Remembering what I was trained for. Maya leaned against the bulkhead. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask. I might not answer. Why did you really disappear? You could have stayed connected. Veteran organizations, old Navy buddies, something. Why choose to be completely alone? Earl was quiet for a moment. The ship hummed around them, alive with the sounds of repair and recovery. When you lose everyone you love, he said finally, there are two choices. You can keep going through the motions, pretending that life still has meaning when it does not. Or you can step away from all of it and find a new kind of peace. He met her eyes. I chose peace, or what I thought was peace. Turns out it was just emptiness wearing a different mask. And now, Earl almost smiled. Now I'm starting to wonder if I made the wrong choice. Being here, helping these sailors, it reminds me of who I used to be. Someone who mattered. Someone with a purpose. Before Maya could respond, footsteps echoed in the passageway outside. Lieutenant Commander Ashworth appeared in the hatchway, his face a complicated mix of emotions that Maya could not quite read. Master Chief Jennings, Ashworth said stiffly. May I speak with you privately? Maya looked at Earl, who nodded slightly. She slipped past Ashworth and into the passageway, but she did not go far. She stopped just around the corner, close enough to hear. Ashworth cleared his throat. I owe you an apology. The words came out like they were being extracted by force. Maya could almost feel the effort it cost him to say them. Earl's voice was calm. Do you know why you owe me an apology, Lieutenant Commander? A long pause. Because I treated you poorly. Because I judged you based on your appearance rather than your character. That is part of it, Earl said. But that is not the real problem. Another pause, longer this time. Earl continued. The real problem is that you would have treated any rescued civilian the same way. Any homeless person, any veteran down on their luck. You did not mistreat me because you did not know I was a decorated SEAL. You mistreated me because you thought I was nobody. And in your mind, nobodies do not deserve basic human dignity. The silence that followed was heavy enough to touch. I'm not apologizing to you because I want your forgiveness, Earl said. I'm not even sure you are capable of giving a genuine apology yet. You are apologizing because you got caught. Because Captain Park saw who you really are. Because your career is now at risk. Ashworth's voice was tight. That is not fair. Is it not? Earl's tone sharpened. Tell me, Lieutenant Commander, how many other people have you treated the way you treated me? How many junior sailors have you dismissed as beneath your notice? How many subordinates have you humiliated because they could not fight back? The silence stretched on. Your grandfather was Rear Admiral Harrison Ashworth, Earl said. I knew of him. Never met him personally, but I knew his reputation. He was a hard man, but he was fair. He treated every sailor under his command with respect, from the lowest seaman to his executive officers. He understood that rank is a responsibility, not a privilege. Ashworth's voice cracked slightly. You know about my grandfather? I know about most of the flag officers from my era. It was my job to know. Earl paused. Your grandfather would be ashamed of how you have conducted yourself on this ship. Not because you mistreated a retired Master Chief, but because you mistreated a human being who needed help. Maya heard a sound that might have been a choke breath. When Ashworth spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. What do I do? That is not for me to tell you, Earl said. But I will say this. It is not too late to become the kind of officer your grandfather was. It is not too late to earn the respect of your crew instead of demanding it. But it requires something that might be very difficult for you. What? Humility. The genuine kind, not the performance you put on for superior officers. Earl's voice softened slightly. You have to actually believe that the people under your command are worth something, that their lives and their dignity matter as much as your career. Until you believe that, truly believe it, you will never be the leader this Navy needs. The passageway was silent for a long moment. Then Maya heard footsteps, moving away toward the main corridor. She pressed herself against the bulkhead as Ashworth passed, and what she saw on his face surprised her. The arrogance was still there, buried deep, but something else was breaking through. Something that looked almost like genuine reflection. Earl emerged from the auxiliary machinery room a moment later. He saw Maya standing there and raised an eyebrow. Eavesdropping, petty officer? Maya felt her cheeks warm. I wanted to make sure he did not try anything. Earl shook his head, but there was no anger in his expression. Lieutenant Commander Ashworth is not a villain. He is a man who lost his way. Whether he finds it again is up to him. He started walking toward the main passageway. Come on. I want to check on the damage control teams in Section 4. Maya fell into step beside him. Do you think he will change? Earl considered the question. I think he might. Shame is a powerful teacher if you let it be. He glanced at her. The question is whether his pride will let him learn. They walked in comfortable silence through the passageways of the wounded ship. Around them, sailors moved with renewed energy. The crisis passed, but the work of recovery ongoing. And somewhere above them, on the bridge of the USS Tempest, Captain Richard Park was making a phone call that would change everything all over again. Captain Richard Park had made hundreds of official calls during his naval career. Reports to Fleet Command, coordination with Allied vessels, routine communications that blurred together over the years. But the call he placed that evening was different. This one went to Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, and it set in motion something that had not happened in decades. The response came faster than he expected. 6 hours after his initial inquiry, Park received an encrypted message marked with classification headers he had rarely seen outside of combat operations. The message was brief, but its implications were staggering. He found Earl in the crew mess, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The old man was staring at nothing, lost in thoughts that Park could only imagine. Around him, sailors moved through their meals with a new awareness, glancing at the Master Chief with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright reverence. Master Chief, Park said, sliding into the seat across from him. We need to talk. Earl looked up, reading something in the captain's face. What did you find? Park placed his tablet on the table between them. I reached out to some contacts at Special Warfare Command. Asked them to verify your service record. He paused, choosing his words carefully. They did more than verify it. Earl's expression remained neutral, but his hands tightened slightly around his coffee cup. Your file is still classified after 50 years, Park continued. Most Vietnam-era SEAL records were declassified in the 90s, but yours was kept sealed by direct order of the Secretary of the Navy. Do you know why? Earl said nothing. They told me that between 1968 and 1972, you were credited with 37 confirmed operations in the Mekong Delta. 14 of those operations are still considered too sensitive to acknowledge publicly. Park leaned forward. They also told me that you were awarded the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts. And that after Vietnam, you spent 20 years as a SEAL instructor before transitioning to surface warfare and eventually commanding the USS Steadfast. That was a long time ago, Earl said quietly. There's more. Park's voice dropped. When you retired in 1998, you were offered a commission. They wanted to make you an officer. You turned it down. Earl almost smiled. I was an enlisted man my whole career. Felt wrong to change that at the end just for a better retirement package. Park shook his head slowly. Master Chief, do you understand what your record means? You are not just a veteran. You are a living legend. There are training programs at Coronado that still use your operations as case studies. There are officers at Special Warfare Command who consider you one of the founding fathers of modern SEAL tactics. Earl looked away. I'm just a man who did his job. You are more than that. Park reached across the table. And the Navy wants to make it right. Earl's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means that when I reported what happened on this ship, when I told them how you were treated and how you responded, they were not happy. Park glanced around the mess, lowering his voice. Admiral Morrison at Fleet Forces Command is personally involved now. He served under you at SEAL Team 3 in the 80s. He remembers you. Earl closed his eyes. James Morrison. He was a young lieutenant when I knew him. Good instincts. I always thought he would go far. He did. And he wants to see you when we reach Norfolk. Park paused. There is talk of a ceremony. Recognition for your actions aboard this ship. Earl shook his head firmly. I did not want a ceremony. I did not save this ship for recognition. I did it because it needed to be done. I understand, Park said. But Master Chief, you have been invisible for 10 years. You chose to disappear, and I respect that choice. But sometimes the world needs to see what real service looks like. Sometimes people need to be reminded that heroes are not just characters in movies. He gestured toward the sailors around them. Look at this crew. Look at how they see you now. You have already changed them. A ceremony would not be for you. It would be for them. Earl was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was struggling to contain. I left because there was nothing left for me. No wife. No son. No reason to keep going. He looked up at Park. But these past 2 days have reminded me of something I forgot. The Navy was never just about the people I lost. It was about the people I could still help. The sailors I could still teach. The lives I could still protect. Park nodded slowly. So what do you want to do? Before Earl could answer, the mess hall hatch opened and Lieutenant Commander Ashworth stepped through. The XO looked different than he had before. The rigid arrogance in his posture had softened, replaced by something more uncertain, more human. He walked directly to Earl's table and stood at attention. Master Chief Jennings, he said formally, I have something to say, and I would like to say it here in front of the crew. The mess hall had gone quiet. Every sailor present was watching. Ashworth took a breath. 2 days ago, I treated you with disrespect and contempt. I judged you based on your appearance, called you a fraud, and accused you of stolen valor. He paused, his jaw tight. I was wrong. Not just factually wrong, but morally wrong. You are a hero, and I treated you like garbage. That is a failure of character that I will carry for the rest of my career. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. When he opened his hand, Earl saw a ring. An Annapolis-class ring, identical to the one Ashworth always wore. This belonged to my grandfather, Ashworth said. Rear Admiral Harrison Ashworth. He gave it to me when I graduated, and he told me to wear it only when I had earned it. He met Earl's eyes. I have not earned it yet, but I'm going to try. He placed the ring on the table and stepped back. Earl looked at the ring for a long moment. Then he picked it up and held it out to Ashworth. Keep it, he said. Your grandfather gave it to you for a reason. Not because of what you were, but because of what he believed you could become. He pressed the ring into Ashworth's hand. Prove him right. Ashworth's eyes glistened. He nodded once, sharply, then turned and walked out of the mess hall without another word. The silence that followed was broken by a single sailor starting to clap. Then another joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire mess hall was applauding, not for Ashworth's apology, but for the man who had received it with more grace than anyone expected. Earl Jennings sat in the middle of that applause, looking profoundly uncomfortable and something else too. He looked like a man remembering what it felt like to belong. The USS Tempest entered Norfolk Naval Station at 0700 on the third day. Earl Jennings stood on the fantail, watching the familiar coastline emerge from the morning mist. He had seen this harbor hundreds of times throughout his career, but it had never looked quite like this. It had never felt like a homecoming. Maya found him there, leaning against the rail with the salt wind pulling at his gray hair. "They're asking for you on the quarterdeck," she said. "There is someone waiting." Earl nodded, but did not move immediately. He kept his eyes on the approaching shore. "I spent 10 years trying to forget this life," he said quietly, trying to convince myself that I did not need it anymore, that the sea and the silence were enough. He turned to look at her. I was lying to myself the whole time. Maya stepped up beside him. "What changed?" "This ship. This crew." He smiled slightly. "You. When you wrapped that blanket around me on the deck, you were the first person in years who looked at me like I was still human. That meant more than you know." Maya felt her throat tighten. "I was just doing my job, Master Chief." "No." Earl shook his head. "You were being kind. There is a difference. Plenty of people do their jobs without being kind. You chose to see me as a person when everyone else saw cargo." He placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Never lose that. The Navy needs officers who lead with compassion. You're going to be one of them someday." Before Maya could respond, footsteps approached behind them. Captain Park appeared with an expression that suggested something significant was about to happen. "Master Chief, there is someone here who insisted on coming aboard before we even finished docking." Park stepped aside, revealing a figure in dress whites with enough gold on his shoulders to command a small fleet. Admiral James Morrison was 70 years old, but he moved with the energy of a man half his age. His face was weathered from decades of service, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had carried him from young SEAL officer to four-star admiral. When he saw Earl, those eyes softened with something that looked like reverence. "Master Chief Jennings," Morrison said. His voice was rough with emotion. "I thought you were dead." Earl straightened, old habits asserting themselves in the presence of a flag officer. "Admiral Morrison, you have done well for yourself." Morrison crossed the deck in 3 quick strides and did something that made every sailor present catch their breath. He embraced Earl Jennings like a brother. 35 years, Morrison said, stepping back, but keeping his hands on Earl's shoulders. 35 years since you taught me how to survive. I have been looking for you ever since you disappeared." He shook his head. "We all have." Earl's composure wavered slightly. "I did not think anyone would notice." "Notice?" Morrison laughed, but there was pain underneath it. "Master Chief, you are a legend. When you vanished, it was like losing a piece of history." He looked around at the gathered crew. "And now I hear you have been saving ships and teaching lessons in your retirement." "I just did what needed to be done, Admiral." Morrison's expression grew serious. "That is exactly why I am here." He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope bearing official Navy seals. "Earl Jennings, by order of the Secretary of the Navy, you are hereby recognized for meritorious service in the face of emergency conditions. Your actions aboard the USS Tempest prevented catastrophic loss of life and demonstrated the highest traditions of naval service." Earl stared at the envelope. "I told Captain Park I did not want recognition." "I know you did." Morrison pressed the envelope into his hands. "But some things are bigger than what we want." He gestured toward the sailors who had gathered on the deck, watching the exchange with undisguised emotion. "These men and women need to see that service matters, that sacrifice is honored, that heroes are real." He lowered his voice. "You owe them that, Earl. You owe yourself that." Earl looked down at the envelope, then up at the faces surrounding him. Young sailors who had never seen combat. Officers who had trained their whole lives for moments of crisis. A crew that had watched him transform from vagrant to savior in the span of 3 days. He thought of Tommy Riley bleeding out in the jungle with a smile on his face because at least his best friend would live. He thought of his wife, holding his hand through the nightmares, loving him even when he could not love himself. He thought of his son, proud in his uniform, following footsteps that would lead him to a roadside bomb in a country far from home. He had carried their memories like stones in his pockets, weighing him down until he could barely move. But standing here now, surrounded by people who saw him as he truly was, he felt something shift. The stones did not disappear, but they grew lighter. They became something he could carry without drowning. "Admiral," Earl said slowly, "there's one thing I would like to request." "Name it." Earl looked at Captain Park, then at Maya, then at the crew assembled on the deck. "I would like to address the crew," he said, "if that is permitted." Morrison nodded to Park, who immediately moved to the ship's intercom system. Within minutes, every sailor not actively manning essential stations had gathered on the main deck. 300 men and women standing at attention, waiting to hear from the man who had saved their ship. Earl Jennings walked to the center of the deck and stood before them. The morning sun caught the worn patch on his chest, making the faded eagle and trident seem to glow. "I am not good at speeches," he began. "Never have been. But there are some things that need to be said." He looked out at the sea of faces before him. 3 days ago, I was drowning. Not in the water, though that too. I was drowning in grief, in loneliness, in the belief that my life no longer had meaning. He paused. "You saved me, not just from the ocean, but from myself." The deck was utterly silent. "I have served with Marines, SEALs, officers, and enlisted sailors across 4 decades," Earl continued. "I have seen courage in places most people cannot imagine. And I am telling you now that what I witnessed on this ship during that fire was as brave and as professional as anything I saw in combat." You let that sink in. "You should be proud. Your family should be proud. Your country is proud, even if it does not always show it." He reached up and touched the patch over his heart. "This patch belonged to a man who died saving my life. For 50 years, I have carried it as a reminder of what real sacrifice looks like." He looked at Morrison, then at Park, then at the assembled crew. "But I understand now that sacrifice is not just about dying for your brothers. It is about living for them too. It is about staying connected, staying present, using whatever time you have left to make a difference." Earl Jennings straightened to his full height, and in that moment, every person on deck saw the warrior he had once been and still was. "I am done hiding," he said. "I am done disappearing." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had finally found his way home. "Thanks to all of you, I remember who I am, and I'm not going to forget again." The aftermath of Earl's speech rippled through the USS Tempest like a wave finding shore. Sailors who had never spoken to each other shared quiet conversations about service and sacrifice. Junior enlisted personnel called their families for the first time in weeks. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of the ship, a reminder that beneath the routines and regulations, they were part of something larger than themselves. Admiral Morrison remained aboard for 3 hours, closeted with Captain Park in the commanding officer stateroom. When the door finally opened, both men wore expressions that suggested difficult decisions had been made. Maya was waiting in the passageway when the Admiral emerged. She snapped to attention, but Morrison waved her to ease. "Petty Officer Thornton," he said, "Captain Park tells me you were the first to show Master Chief Jennings kindness when he came aboard." "I just did what seemed right, Admiral." Morrison studied her for a moment. "That is exactly what good leaders do. They see what is right, and they do it, even when it is not popular." He glanced back at Park. "I have recommended you for accelerated advancement consideration. Your conduct during this situation demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment the Navy needs in its future officers." Maya felt her cheeks flush. "Thank you, Admiral. But I was not the only one. Seaman Okonkwo, Corpsman Reyes, others treated him with respect too." Morrison smiled. "And that is why you deserve advancement. You share credit instead of hoarding it." He nodded to Park and continued down the passageway, his aides falling into step behind him. Park lingered, watching Maya with an evaluating expression. "Walk with me, Petty Officer." They moved through the ship together, passing damage control teams still working on repairs, and sailors going about their duties with renewed purpose. Park said nothing until they reached the fantail, where the Norfolk skyline spread before them in the afternoon light. "Lieutenant Commander Ashworth submitted his resignation this morning," Park said quietly. Maya turned sharply. "His resignation?" Park nodded. "He came to me after his apology in the mess hall. said he had been thinking about what Master Chief Jennings told him. About character. About the kind of officer his grandfather would have wanted him to be. He looked out at the water. He said he realized he had been wearing the uniform without earning it. That he needed to step away and figure out who he really wanted to become. What did you tell him? I told him that resignation was not the answer. Park's voice was measured. Running away from failure is not the same as learning from it. I suggested he request a transfer to a training command, somewhere he can work with new recruits. Learn humility by teaching others. Maya considered this. Did he accept? After some discussion, Park turned to face her. He also asked me to pass along a message to you. To me? He said he owes you an apology as well. For dismissing your concerns about how the Master Chief was being treated. For creating an environment where cruelty was acceptable. He paused. He said he hopes that someday he can become the kind of officer that someone like you would be proud to serve under. Maya did not know what to say. The Ashworth who had sneered at her concerns 3 days ago seemed like a different person entirely. People can change, Park said, reading her expression. It does not happen often, and it does not happen easily. But when someone genuinely wants to be better, they deserve the chance to try. They stood in silence for a moment, watching a tugboat guide a massive cargo ship into its berth. What about Chief Drucker? Maya asked. Park's expression hardened slightly. Chief Drucker has been reassigned to shore duty pending a formal review of his conduct. Unlike Lieutenant Commander Ashworth, he has shown no indication of remorse or self-reflection. He shook his head. Some people change. Some people just get better at hiding who they really are. Drucker falls into the second category. Maya thought of the cruel smile on Drucker's face when he had taken Earl's patch. The casual malice in his voice when he called Earl Cargo. Some stains did not wash out. Where is Master Chief Jennings now? She asked. Park smiled for the first time. Admiral Morrison offered him quarters at the base, but he declined. Said he wanted to stay aboard until the crew was released for liberty. Something about wanting to shake every hand before he leaves. That sounds like him. It does. Park looked at her with something like paternal pride. You know, petty officer, in 20 years of service, I have seen a lot of sailors come and go. Most of them do their jobs and move on. But every once in a while, you meet someone who changes the way you see things. He nodded slowly. You're one of those people. So is Earl Jennings. This ship is better for having both of you aboard. Maya felt tears prick her eyes, but held them back. Thank you, Captain. That means more than I can say. Park straightened his uniform and turned back toward the interior of the ship. Go find the Master Chief, he said over his shoulder. I believe he was looking for you. Maya found Earl in the crew berthing area, surrounded by a cluster of young sailors who were hanging on his every word. He was telling a story about a training exercise gone wrong in the Philippines, his hands moving expressively as he described a young SEAL officer falling into a rice paddy in full gear. The sailors laughed at the punchline, and Earl laughed with them. It was a sound Maya had not heard from him before. Genuine, unguarded, free. He spotted her at the edge of the group and excused himself, making his way through the crowd of sailors who parted for him with obvious respect. Petty Officer Thornton, he said, I was hoping to find you. Captain Park said the same thing. Maya smiled. Popular man, suddenly. Earl chuckled. Strange how nearly dying can change people's opinions of you. He grew more serious. I want to thank you. Properly. For everything. You already thanked me, Master Chief. Several times. Words are easy. Earl reached into his pocket and produced something small. This is harder. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a challenge coin, worn smooth by decades of handling. On one side was the seal trident. On the other, an inscription that read, "The only easy day was yesterday." This was given to me by my commanding officer in 1970, Earl said, after the operation where I saved Captain Park's father. I have carried it for over 50 years. He pressed it into Maya's hand. I want you to have it. Maya stared at the coin, overwhelmed. Master Chief, I cannot accept this. It is too important. That is exactly why I want you to have it. Earl closed her fingers around the worn metal. You reminded me that kindness matters. That seeing people as human beings is not weakness, it is strength. He smiled, and his eyes were bright with emotion. Carry this with you. Let it remind you of what you already know. And someday, when you meet a young sailor who needs to learn the same lesson, pass it on. Maya clutched the coin to her chest, unable to speak. Earl Jennings placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. You're going to do great things, Maya Thornton. I'm certain of it. And for the first time since he had come aboard the USS Tempest as a half-drowned vagrant, Earl Jennings looked like a man who had found something worth living for. The ceremony took place on the pier beside the USS Tempest 3 days after the ship docked in Norfolk. Earl Jennings had argued against it until Admiral Morrison reminded him that some battles were not worth fighting. This was one of them. 300 sailors stood in formation under a clear December sky. The crew of the Tempest had been joined by veterans from across the region, men and women who had heard the story of the homeless man who saved a destroyer. Among them stood a contingent of retired SEALs, gray-haired warriors who had served in Vietnam and the decades that followed. They had come to honor one of their own. Earl stood at the center of the platform in borrowed dress whites, the uniform fitting him like it had never left his body. The Navy Cross ribbon sat above his left breast pocket, joined by rows of decorations that told the story of a lifetime of service. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he no longer looked like he wanted to disappear. Maya watched from the front row of the crew formation, the challenge coin warm in her pocket. Beside her stood Seaman Okonkwo, Corpsman Reyes, and the other sailors who had shown Earl kindness when kindness was not required. They had been given positions of honor at Captain Park's insistence. Admiral Morrison approached the microphone, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. We gather today to recognize a man who spent his life serving this nation and asked for nothing in return. A man who, when he had every reason to walk away from the world, chose instead to save the lives of sailors he had never met. Morrison paused, letting his words settle. Master Chief Petty Officer Earl Jennings, United States Navy, retired. SEAL Team 1, veteran of Vietnam, hero of the USS Tempest. The applause that followed was thunderous. Earl stood rigidly at attention, his jaw tight with emotion he was struggling to contain. Morrison continued when the noise subsided. Master Chief Jennings was awarded the Navy Cross in 1970 for actions in combat that remain classified to this day. He served this nation for 31 years, training generations of special operators and commanding ships with distinction. And when he retired, he disappeared. Not because he was running from his past, but because he had given everything he had and believed there was nothing left. Morrison turned to face Earl directly. Master Chief, you were wrong. There was still something left. There was still you. And this week, you proved that the warrior who saved 19 men in the Mekong Delta 50 years ago is the same warrior who saved 300 sailors on the Tempest. The uniform may change. The years may pass. But the heart of a true sailor never fades. He stepped aside as a young lieutenant approached carrying a wooden case. Inside, resting on blue velvet, was a medal that made the assembled veterans draw a collective breath. By order of the Secretary of the Navy, Morrison announced, Master Chief Petty Officer Earl Jennings is hereby awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism not involving conflict with an enemy. His actions during the shipboard emergency aboard USS Tempest directly prevented catastrophic loss of life and demonstrated extraordinary courage in the highest traditions of naval service. Morrison lifted the medal from its case and pinned it to Earl's chest. The gold gleamed in the winter sunlight. Earl looked down at the medal, then out at the crowd of faces before him. Sailors he had helped, veterans he had served with, a community he had tried to leave behind, but that had never truly let him go. He stepped to the microphone, his movements slow and deliberate. I'm not good at accepting praise, he said. His voice was rough but steady. For most of my life, I believed that service was its own reward. That recognition was unnecessary. That the best thing a warrior could do was complete the mission and fade into the shadows. He touched the patch on his chest, the worn SEAL Team 1 insignia that had traveled with him for half a century. I carried this patch as a reminder of the men who did not come home. Men like Tommy Riley, who died in my arms in a jungle on the other side of the world. I thought carrying their memory meant carrying it alone. I thought honoring their sacrifice meant disappearing the way they did. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. I was wrong. Honoring them means living. It means staying connected to the people and the purpose that gave their deaths meaning. It means being present for the sailors who come after us, teaching them what we learned, showing them what service really looks like. He looked at Maya, standing in the front row with tears streaming down her face. A young petty officer reminded me of that when she wrapped a blanket around a drowning old man and treated him like a human being. She did not know who I was. She did not care. She just saw someone who needed help, and she helped. He turned back to the crowd. That is what the Navy is supposed to be. That is what service is supposed to mean. Not ribbons and ceremonies. Not rank and recognition. Just people taking care of each other. Seeing each other. Refusing to let anyone become invisible. Earl straightened, his bearing shifting into something that made every veteran present stand a little taller. I am 71 years old. I have buried friends, family, and pieces of myself in more places than I can count. But standing here today, surrounded by shipmates old and new, I understand something I forgot a long time ago. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man finally at peace. The mission is not over until you take your last breath. And I have a few breaths left in me yet. The applause that followed shook the pier. Veterans embraced. Sailors cheered. Admiral Morrison wiped his eyes with a handkerchief he would later deny having. Maya pushed through the crowd to reach Earl as he stepped down from the platform. She did not salute. She did not speak. She simply hugged him, and he hugged her back. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," Earl said softly. "Thank you." The ceremony ended, but the conversations continued for hours. Earl shook hands with every sailor from the Tempest. He traded stories with veterans he had not seen in decades. He accepted an invitation from Admiral Morrison to speak at the Naval Academy, and another from the SEAL Training Command in Coronado to address the newest class of candidates. As the sun began to set over Norfolk, Earl Jennings stood alone at the end of the pier, looking out at the water that had been his home for so many years. The USS Tempest floated quietly at her berth, her hull still bearing the scars of the fire that had almost consumed her. A familiar figure appeared beside him. Captain Park stood in silence for a moment before speaking. "What will you do now, Master Chief?" Earl considered the question. "I have been running from ghosts for 10 years, he said. "I think it is time I started living with them instead. You know the Navy would welcome you back in any capacity. Advisory role, training consultant, whatever you want." Earl nodded slowly. "I know, and I might take them up on it. But first, I need to visit some graves I have been avoiding. Have some conversations I should have had a long time ago." Park extended his hand. "It has been an honor, Master Chief." Earl shook it firmly. "The honor was mine, Captain. Take care of your ship, and take care of sailors like Maya Thornton. They're the future of this Navy." He walked down the pier toward the parking lot where Admiral Morrison's staff car waited to take him wherever he wanted to go. Behind him, the USS Tempest's lights flickered on against the gathering darkness, a ship that had been saved by a man everyone had dismissed as worthless. If you connected with this story, drop a comment about what resonated most with you. Maybe you know a veteran whose service was overlooked or forgotten. Their stories deserve to be told, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see them for who they really are. Earl Jennings climbed into the car and did not look back. He did not need to. For the first time in 10 years, he was not leaving anything behind. He was moving forward, and the ghosts he carried were no longer weights dragging him down. They were wings.